Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Roseman again, and today we're going to take a look at the beginnings of the Cold War era, which is going to last from 1945 until 1991. So, in terms of contextualization, this comes directly after World War II and overlaps with the process of decolonization. And the Cold War and decolonization fit together very neatly here in the fact that both the major powers of the world, the United States and the Soviet Union, both had vested interest in that decolonization process. More on that later. But before we get started in depth here, we need to understand what a Cold War exactly is. We have looked at plenty of hot wars or heated wars through our course, but this is a Cold War. And what makes a Cold War cold or frigid is the fact that a Cold War is a state of conflict between nations that does not involve direct military action between the two major players. All right. So the two major nations involved here in this Cold War between 1945 and 1991, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, those two nations never directly face one another in open combat. All right. Instead, they found ways to compete against one another by other means, whether it was propaganda, by means of influencing other nations, or actually carrying out violent conflict, but by means of using what are known as proxies, basically nations or peoples that stand in your place and do the fighting and conflict for you. Very twisted way of conflict. And that way, you could think of there being truly a third world war that morphed from World War II into this third major global showdown. And actually, more people died in the Cold War than in World War II, if you want to think of it that way, in what were known as proxy wars. So, for example, again, neither the United States or the Soviet Union directly fought against one another as they vied for global influence, but instead they used other powers, other nations, other peoples to do their fighting for them. For example, the Korean War is a good example of a proxy war early in the Cold War era. In that war, the United States directly had troops on the ground, and we had support of the United Nations. But we also had allies fighting alongside us, for example, the South Koreans. However, the Soviet Union, though they had vested interest in the outcome of the Korean War, they did not put their own troops on the ground. Instead, the Soviet Union backed the North Korean military through financial aid, military aid, and that way the Soviet Union fought against the United States, but by using this intermediary power of North Korea, a brand new force in the world. All right. We also saw in the Korean War that the new People's Republic of China, or Mao Zedong, intervened in that Korean War on behalf of North Korea and fought alongside North Koreans, helping to try to spread the communist influence and beat back U.S. Influence in that area of East Asia. So nonetheless, Cold War, think of it as a standoff between major powers without them directly going into conflict with one another, even though it came very close several times to be all-out war between nations, the United States and the Soviet Union. So with that in mind, we're looking at ideologies in conflict, namely pro-capitalistic, pro-democratic outlooks versus communist outlooks, economically speaking, with the major backing of the United States and the Soviet Union, respectively, for each of those ideologies. So to understand about the beginnings of the Cold War, we've got to go back again to the end of World War II, in which the Nazi Empire was beaten back by both the United States and the Soviet Union, with the Soviet Union moving in from the east, moving into Eastern Europe and liberating those nations from Nazi control until they make their way to the eastern areas of Germany, whereas the United States, with the support of the other allies, namely Britain, France, Belgium, the Dutch, Canada, for example, coming in from the west, beginning with the liberation, starting at Normandy and moving from the west towards Germany, liberating the Netherlands, Belgium, and France as they go through. So there, as of May 1945, the Soviet Red Army, the Communist Army, and the rest of the Allied powers meet there in Germany. And with that, May 1945, there's no more Nazi empire. But instead, we see a Europe that's dominated by these two major powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. So that's where that onset of the Cold War begins. And with that, we see a major shift in global power. All right. So during the length of World War II, there were regular Allied conferences, meetings of the key leaders of the Allied powers in World War II. Usually this included Winston Churchill of Britain, Prime Minister of Britain, Franklin Roosevelt of the United States, succeeded by Harry Truman of the United States as president, and then also Stalin of the Soviet Union. And these meetings were meant to determine planning strategies for defeating the Nazi Empire and also the Japanese, but also trying to settle what Europe would look like as soon as the war was over. And disagreements certainly mounted between the Soviet Union, a communist nation, led by a totalitarian dictator, Stalin, and the rest of the Allied powers. Right, but once the war is over, it had been agreed that both Germany and Korea would be temporarily partitioned with the purpose of rebuilding and reunifying those nations under democracy and capitalism. And we also see major shifts in terms of global power from the Nazi Empire being completely annihilated, as well as the Japanese Empire being destroyed as of 1945. When it comes to the old traditional powers of Britain and France, those empires that had dominant imperial states worldwide, they are financially exhausted after fighting two global wars. And this is going to set up that process of decolonization as of the late 1940s through the 1970s. So they're losing their empires. And what's left, then, is the United States and the Soviet Union. And we're going to throw out a new term here, the superpowers, that are as a way that we can classify the United States and the USSR, starting with the United States as the very first superpower, followed by the Soviet Union as of 1949. So these aren't just regular powers or nations. These are superpowers. They have superhuman strength. And what gives them that superhuman power is the fact that they have powerful economies that are industrially based. We saw how the United States was able to avoid direct attacks on its industrial infrastructure and turn the tide of World War II in favor of the Allied powers. And despite the fact that the Soviet Union was beaten hard by the Nazi Empire initially, they had a massive industrial economic core that had been built up over several decades by Joseph Stalin using what were known as 5-year plans, an example of central government planning. So whenever they come out of World War II on the victorious side, they still have an extremely powerful industrial economy. But what edges them over into superpower status is the fact that of their military means. First, with the United States becoming a superpower in the development of our atomic weapons, as demonstrated on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. But by 1949, the Soviet Union had tested successfully their very first atomic weapon. So this means that they have the ability to compete globally for influence. And this is what is going to help set up this global showdown between the economic ideologies of capitalism as represented by the United States and the economic ideology of communism as represented by the Soviet Union. So, in terms of the rest of the world, they are left figuring out what to do with the ashes of the world from World War II, whereas the US and Soviet Union are going into this head-to-head showdown in what becomes known as the Cold War. Over time, and rather quickly, this is made apparent, all right, the world basically becomes bipolar in a lot of ways after World War II because of this showdown between the US and the Soviet Union. The world essentially chooses sides. The choosing of sides behind either the United States or choosing sides behind the Soviet Union is known as alignment. So those nations that back the United States and represented by U.S. interests, that becomes known as the West, all right? So a new idea of what the West is. It's also known as the First World. So First World nations are those that are aligned with the ideologies of capitalism and democracy, and the United States being its symbolic and literal head, all right? The other side of the coin is the East, also known as the Second World, representing communistic ideology and guided by the Soviet Union and its global influence. Now, we're leaving out another world, and that's the Third World. And this is a little bit different from what you might have as a current understanding of what Third World means. We oftentimes think now that Third World means just poor, destitute countries. But during the height of the Cold War, Third World nations were ones that did not align or practice non-alignment. So they chose neither the side of the West or the East. They saw themselves as separate nations that were not going to be guided by either side of the Cold War. The vast majority of countries that were created because of decolonization were non-aligned or third world countries. For example, India, under Nehru, whenever it gained its independence from the British Raj in the late 1940s, Nehru, as the first prime minister, claimed non-alignment. And they had good reasons for not choosing sides, but the United States and the Soviet Union nonetheless try to influence these brand new countries, of which there are dozens upon dozens of new nations formed within about 30, 40 years after World War II. All right. So this is a good visual to represent or to get a grasp of how both the United States and the Soviet Union viewed one another here after World War II. Both saw the other as being imperialistic, trying to grab and stretch for the expansion of their ideologies and therefore also resources and people worldwide. They feel insecure. So what this does is helps to strengthen the desire by the United States and the Soviet Union to build alliances and to build up stronger military capabilities that unfortunately rely upon nuclear technologies. And that will enter our world into a new phase where nuclear destruction is a true possibility. All right. So to recap here in a lot of ways, the Soviet Union, as soon as World War II is done, it's very clear that they are the dominant European power. They had liberated almost all the Eastern European nations from the Nazis, and as they did, Stalin is seeing that as a way by which the Soviet Union could spread its influence beyond just the Soviet Union. So as they liberate Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania from Nazi influence, the communist Soviet Union brings in communist influence there to those Eastern European countries. Historians call this area of Eastern Europe the Eastern Bloc, or Soviet satellite nations. So if you think of, and that's not a misspelling of bloc, that's proper, B-L-O-C in this case. It's a group of nations that share a common characteristic, at least in this case, of communism or Soviet influence. But check that out, Soviet satellites, check that out. We know that a satellite, it's an object that orbits around a planet, like a satellite. A man-made satellite revolves around the Earth. in this way, these Eastern European nations, like Poland, revolve around the interests of the Soviet Union because new communist parties are established in each one of these Eastern European countries. And in fitting with the Soviet view on government, all other political parties are outlawed. So therefore, they have to answer to, in a way, Moscow from the Soviet Union. So they might technically look like they're independent states, but they're in allegiance with the Soviet Union, though the vast majority of people, citizens in those nations, did not necessarily want to be under Soviet influence. All right. Because of this rapid expansion of Soviet influence into Eastern Europe, Western Europe is really concerned. They know that the Soviet Union is powerful and Western European nations are weak. So they look to a protector who has the economic and military means to protect them against potential Soviet aggression now that the Nazis are gone. And that nation is going to be the United States. All right. So this wouldn't have been possible unless the United States had come out of its isolation as of 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor and our quick involvement in World War II, where we, at the same time the Soviet Union was so-called liberating these Eastern European countries, we were liberating Western European nations and claiming protection of democracy and capitalism in those Western European countries like France and Netherlands and Belgium. But as soon, again, World War II is done, we turn our anti-Nazi policy, since the Nazis are defeated, into an anti-communist policy. We see the Soviet Union as the big global threat, not just a European threat, but a global threat. So here's another visual. Here is Europe after World War II, and all those red areas, that includes the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries written in their local names and abbreviations. But here I'm going to throw out another term for you. In 1946, the former Prime Minister, Winston Churchill of Britain, he had just been defeated in elections, and he was invited to the United States to go on a speaking tour. In 1946, he traveled to colleges throughout the United States, and in one of his speeches that he gave, he warned of this growing threat of the Soviet Union and its apparent dominance of governments in Eastern Europe in what will become known as these Eastern Bloc nations. He described that an iron curtain had descended across Europe. An iron curtain, all right? And behind this iron curtain is the Soviet Union and its dominant influence. So I'm going to throw up here this visual of the Iron Curtain. There it is, all right? So everything to the east of that line, that Iron Curtain, so to speak, the symbolic effort by the Soviet Union to block itself and its satellite states from open contact with the West and its allied states, all right, there's the Eastern Bloc. And on the other side, to the west of that Iron Curtain, you have the democratic and capitalistic nations that are under the protection of the United States following World War II. So again, you can see the bipolarization, the division, the extremes that not just Europe is going to after World War II, but also the world, as we see mounting tensions building up here. All right, so Eastern Bloc nations behind the Iron Curtain. If you'll recall that right after World War II is finished, Germany was temporarily split into 4 occupation zones with the purpose that it was eventually going to be reunified as a democratic and capitalistic Germany. But in 1949, Germany was partitioned. So we know that means splitting into parts. In this case, into 2 new nations. East Germany, where the Soviet Union had an occupation zone, it becomes its own independent country under Soviet communist influence. Even its capital, it's really weird, its capital, Berlin, which was completely inside East Germany, it was partitioned as well. So there was an East and a West Berlin. East Berlin was a communist portion of the city, whereas West Berlin was a free, democratic, capitalist Berlin, but it was surrounded entirely by communist East Germany. So in order to prevent citizens of East Berlin from escaping into freedom into West Berlin and then getting a ride by plane out of West Berlin to freedom, the Soviet government built a massive wall that encircled their Berlin, all right, or encircled at least East Berlin to prevent people from escaping to freedom. So Berlin Wall, people think that was built immediately after World War II. It was not until 1961, but it becomes a symbolic representation of this Cold War division. Now, on the other hand, West Germany, it's a free and democratic capitalist nation with strong support by the United States. And so in that way, you have, again, bipolarization of Germany into these two brand new countries. This is not going to change until 1990, whenever East Germany and West Germany are once again reunited into the present nation of Germany. All right. If we look at East Asia, similar things happen here with partitioning of nations. Korea, which had been under Japanese occupation since the very early 1900s, with their creeping imperialism, as soon as the Japanese are defeated in World War II, Korea was also temporarily partitioned into North Korea and South Korea, with North Korea occupied by the Soviet Union and the Red Army to help them rebuild, and South Korea occupied by the United States. But again, the purpose was to help them rebuild, each with their own separate portions, and then reunite into a single independent nation of Korea. Nonetheless, by 1950, all right, it was very clear that North Korea was under the guidance of the Soviet Union, creating a communist state there. South Korea, a capitalistic nation with heavy U.S. influence, although we didn't really support democracy there. It was a dictatorship. It was a pro-U.S. democracy, so who really cares? Anyhow, what this led up to was a permanent division of North Korea and South Korea. And in 1950, the North Korean government, with the backing of the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea. U.S. Protected South Korea with an attempt to reclaim South Korea, reunify the country, and install a communist government in South Korea, creating a single nation of Korea that would be communist. All right, 1953, the war basically ended in a stalemate, and the war pretty much ended along the same lines where it began, with that partition border between North Korea and South Korea. And today, that line separating North Korea and South Korea, between communist and capitalistic Korea, is the most militarily fortified location in the world, called the DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone. It's a buffer between these two nations. And technically, the Korean War was never ended. It ended in a ceasefire, but peace treaties were never signed. So technically, the Korean War is still ongoing. And there's times where you'll hear that what's called saber rattling, where North Korea threatens to invade and military tensions mount up between the two. To make matters worse, all right, the largest populated nation in the world in 1949, China, became the People's Republic of China. In 1949, you know that Mao Zedong's CCP, or Chinese Communist Party, defeated Jiang Jiexi's Republic of China, ran them into exile to Taiwan, and Mao Zedong proclaimed control over mainland China as the legitimate political power in China itself, a communist state. So there's clear indications that communist influence is spreading beyond the Soviet Union into other independent sovereign nations. And that's something we fear. All right, because we fear a true communist revolution that will be truly global, as Karl Marx warned in the Communist Manifesto. All right. To take this to a whole new level, though, And again, what made the United States and the Soviet Union was the fact that both, by 1949, had developed nuclear armaments. So in 1945, the United States, followed by the Soviet Union in 1949. There begins, and fitting into this Cold War context, is another arms race. All right, but this one with the potential to destroy the world several times over, or as we go in several years into the Cold War period. All right. We know that arms races are basically competitions between major countries or any country trying to outdo one another in order to prevent war. With this idea that you wouldn't dare go to war with a country that could destroy you in a war itself. But here you have that added destructibility of and the firepower of nuclear weapons. And you get this new term, this acronym, MAD. The world is going mad. But what this MAD, or MAD, stands for is mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction. Meaning that if you think about it, mutually assured destruction, basically the idea that, well, if one nation, one of these nations uses its nuclear weapons against the other, well, the other is going to retaliate with their nuclear weapons. And what we'll see is the complete annihilation of both of these countries, and maybe taking down the entire world with it, the more and more nuclear weapons are developed, or what's known as nuclear proliferation. So it's really ironic here. It's really odd because, again, did the U.S. and Soviet Union never go to war with one another? No, they never did. And what a lot of thought has gone into this as to why that was because of MAD, mutually assured destruction. So it was feared that, well, if you were the first one to use a nuclear weapon or nuclear weapons, your whole nuclear arsenal, then the other nation would retaliate completely, maybe even more so. And again, it would take out both countries. So the fear of complete annihilation, assured destruction of one another, it actually prevents outright war with one another. And instead, we turn to using proxies or stand-in nations that do not have or will not use nuclear capabilities. All right. And that's where we see this Third World War, this Cold War, actually heating up into outright conflict, violent conflict in the case of, say, the Korean War or the Vietnam War or the Cuban Revolution, to name a few of those major proxy wars. So really odd how this works out. All right, I'm going to show you here a clip. Hopefully this will work as I am making this video. We regularly flex our muscles, though. We never use our nuclear weapons against one another. And the United States is the only nation in history so far to have used nuclear weapons on a civilian population and in wartime itself. But throughout the Cold War, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and both nations' allies as well, tested nuclear weapons. And it was well known that these countries were doing that. One of our first major set of nuclear tests after World War II was known as the Bikini Test. And this isn't a joke. Bikini is an island in the South Pacific, part of the Marshall Islands, part of our U.S. territories in the South Pacific. And what better place to destroy than absolute Pacific paradise? So in 1946, we test a series, between 1946 and 1958, we test a series of more and more powerful nuclear weapons. The press, U.S. press, was invited to come and observe these. And this was, in a way, a means of getting the word out on what our U.S. capabilities were in this Cold War era. And the Soviet Union did the same thing elsewhere. They exploded bombs in Kazakhstan and Siberia and in the Arctic. Usually our nuclear testing sites were in the South Pacific and Nevada. That's really funny. They're maybe not funny, but really odd. There's pictures from the 1950s of Las Vegas on the Las Vegas Strip, and you can see where people are walking down the Las Vegas Strip and out into the desert. You can see these mushroom clouds exploding. People just going on about their business, whereas while the U.S. military is testing nuclear weaponry in the Cold War era. Nonetheless, just as a side fact and or fun fact here, in late 1946, a French fashion designer introduced a new bathing suit that he named after this location of U.S. nuclear testing sites. This was the hottest new fashion design in swimwear, and he called it the bikini. And in a lot of ways, it sent shockwaves through the designer world. But we know that certainly has not gone away. But anyways, a link there. Hot fashion design of the mid to late 1940s, named for this nuclear testing site. So I want to show you a clip here of one of these earlier bikini tests, just so you can see an idea of this nuclear destructibility that came with the Cold War era. And I'll tell you too, while I'm setting this up, this is a very small nuclear detonation. So what you'll see here is a nuclear detonation out here in the Pacific, and the little things that look like ships, look like toy ships, they are actually full-size decommissioned naval destroyers from World War II. They're no longer being used, but this was a test to see what the effects were of a burst, a mushroom cloud burst of a nuclear weapon out in the ocean. And you'll see the mushroom cloud from different angles. So just check this out. Again, this is this is real life footage from the bikini tests. You can see the shock wave expanding outward from the bomb site. You can see especially in the next scene. So they look like toys, little models, but that is actually military footage of full-size ships compared to this nuclear blast. Here's the aerial view. You can see that shock wave heading out. There it is. All those ships. And there's nobody on these ships. So again, it's just a test. All right. So you get the idea of that destruction that went along with the blast. All right. So again, think both nations are flexing their muscles towards one another in a display of power, and basically making sure the other backs down from any direct conflict over the expansion of their ideologies. All right. So moving on. We know that the United States, it needs allies in this global conflict, global competition with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, they view the same thing, or view their strategies in the same way. They've got to build allies in order to compete against U.S. global influence in this competition over economic ideologies. Money speaks, all right? It speaks big. The more money you have, it becomes a great tool for nation states. And that is certainly true in the case of the Cold War era right after World War II and what becomes known as the Marshall Plan. Our U.S. Secretary of State as of 1947 was George C. Marshall, and he proposed a financial aid package. And think about it, who would be wanting money right after World War II? Well, it's those nations that have been financially ruined because of things like Allied aerial bombing at the end of World War II. Nations that had their infrastructure destroyed because of the war effort. So George Marshall, what he's thinking is that, hey, these countries need help. They need a bailout. They need to get back on their feet. Well, the United States is in a good position to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to offer up a big financial aid package of $13 billion. That is not considering inflation for today's economy. All right. But we offer any nation that wants it money to help rebuild Europe. All right. So anything, nations, you got it. No strings attached. Well, not exactly. But anyhow, if you want the money, just tell us, we'll give you the money. All right? You don't have to pay it back. Not financially speaking, at least. All right? So what winds up happening is that Western European nations, they outright accept this Marshall Plan money. All right? They line up and we pay out. But Eastern European nations reject it. So think about this. Again, why would Eastern European nations reject Marshall Plan money, this money from the United States? Well, the Soviet Union told them not to take it because we know the Soviet Union was influential in controlling these Eastern Bloc, Eastern European nations, Soviet satellite countries. So they reject it, all right? But this money goes a long ways to help rebuilding France and Britain and Denmark and the Netherlands and Belgium and West Germany, amongst others, all right? But Eastern Europeans, though they were offered it, they don't accept that money because of the influence that they were under with the Soviet Union, all right? We do very similar things with Japan. We basically occupy Japan when the war is over, and we pour financial resources into rebuilding Japan's industrial economy. We wanted strong allies, all right? So if you think about it again, really, Marshall Plan, why in the world would we offer up this money? Well, if you were thinking that money talks and it can be a way of buying influence, well, that's exactly right. We saw this financial aid package of the Marshall Plan a way of buying friends, all right? Friends in this Cold War, post-World War II Cold War era. Because we could always hold it over their heads saying that, hey, you remember whenever we helped bail you out after World War II and helped you rebuild and get you back running in your modern economy? Well, that was the United States. How about you help us out? All right. So the Marshall Plan is a means by which we are building stronger allies in this Cold War period. And it makes sense. It's the Western European countries that accept it. All right. At the same time, by 1947, and this lasts through 1991, it was very clear that communist influence was spreading beyond the Soviet Union. Other nations were falling to Soviet influence, like North Korea, the People's Republic of China, and well beyond. And it becomes the new foreign policy objective of the United States government after World War II to contain communism where it already existed. So think of us trying to put a lid on communism from spreading further than it already was. And this prompts us to use other strategies beyond just financial aid packages like the Marshall Plan to limit the expansion of communist and Soviet influence. All right. So again, this is the idea of this containment policy is the attempt to prevent communism from spreading where it already exists. So how? It's through financial tools, financial packages, espionage. All right. Espionage is spying. What was our spy system? The CIA. And proxy wars, where again, we use other nations to do fighting for us against the Soviet Union, or if we have troops on the ground like we did in the Vietnam War, for example, the Soviet Union will back other groups in resisting that U.S. activity. So, for example, in the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union, as well as the People's Republic of China, they backed what was called the Viet Minh or communist North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, the guy that showed up back at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, hoping to get independence for Vietnam from France. And that didn't happen. We see now how that plays out here, even in this Cold War period. But also nuclear proliferation. This idea that the more nuclear weapons you have, the less likely you're going to be able to, or the less likely your nation is going to go to war with the other, if you have this nuclear arsenal that is capable of destroying not just your enemy, but also the world several times over. All right. It makes sense as well that both the United States and the Soviet Union would build up military alliances. Following World War II, as a containment policy strategy, we developed a new military alliance led by the United States called NATO. Do not confuse this with NAFTA, all right? This is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which existed from 1949, and it still exists, even though the Cold War is long gone, 1949 all the way to the present. So this included the United States and most Western European countries, as well as Canada, all right? Now, in response, the Soviet Union, they use the same strategies. So whatever we do, they do the same. Or whatever they do, we respond likewise. So the Soviet Union, they have their own financial aid packages. They use their own espionage systems through the KGB. They fund proxy wars. For example, again, Vietnam War, Korean War, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979, that lasted until 1989. They use the same strategies. And they also had their own military alliance system that began in 1955, known as the Warsaw Pact, Warsaw being the capital of Poland, but an Eastern Bloc nation. It was primarily composed of the Soviet Union leading it, along with its Eastern Bloc countries, as a military alliance to block and protect against what was seen as U.S. aggression guided through NATO. All right, so things are getting bad, and don't think, though, the United States is necessarily playing fairly, of course, as made obvious by these different strategies. And even though we claim that we're making the world safer for democracy in light of this Soviet influence worldwide, we had the attitude that whatever was necessary to limit Soviet expansion, so be it. So even though we talk about the greatness of democracy during this Cold War era, we oftentimes find our government backing dictators that act in a totalitarian way. They act just as brutal as leaders like Stalin. There was a rather famous phrase, and forgive me for speaking like this on a lecture here, but this is a direct quote. Here's a reflection of our U.S. attitude in the Cold War towards dictators and our backing of them. We had the attitude that, well, we don't care if he's a son of a bitch as long as he's our son of a bitch. And again, that's not a quote from me. That's a historical quote there. But we were notorious, it turns out, for backing dictators that were pro-U.S., but absolutely brutal towards their own people. And a good example of that is going to happen in those newly independent nations in Africa and Asia that were formed as a result of decolonization. One example you'll see in that decolonization lesson we do next week, a man named Mobutu Sese Seko of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Nothing democratic about the Congo under Mobutu, but he was an absolute brutal dictator that ruled the Congo with an iron fist for decades, but was pro-U.S., and therefore we liked him. All right, and we back his occupation of the so-called presidency of the Congo. Nonetheless, let's wrap up here because that was a lot thrown at you at one time with the Cold War. Here's a visual for the Marshall Plan. those nations that are receiving, accepting U.S. money, financial aid after World War II. So those countries basically accepting the friendship. We're buying friends in this Cold War era. All right. Whereas the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc refused to accept our money, seeing it as dirty American capitalistic aid. That, well, they realize that they'll owe the U.S. something later on. So they reject that money. And watch here, if you just check out the line between the Eastern Bloc, or those nations that accept the money and those that don't, it follows perfectly the Iron Curtain. Same thing for the NATO nations versus the Warsaw Pact, at least in terms of Europe. What you can't see here, of course, is the United States and Canada being major nations of NATO. But it follows, again, the Iron Curtain, all right, between the East and the West. So the Cold War is here to stay for a long time, and we'll be coming back to the ideas of the Cold War as we move forward in analyzing developments in the Soviet Union and in the West and in East Asia, as well as that decolonization process.